Picture this. You're at a fancy dinner party with the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Alien diplomats who could destroy entire star systems with a thought. Military commanders who've conquered worlds. Ancient species that have ruled the cosmos for millions of years. Then, a human teenager points at someone across the room and says 5 simple words that make every single one of these cosmic powerhouses go completely silent. What could possibly make creatures who fear nothing suddenly afraid? What secret could a simple human family be hiding that would terrify beings who've seen the birth and death of stars? The answer will change how you think about humanity's place in the universe forever. Some stories are about humans being the underdogs who rise up. This isn't one of those stories. This is about the moment the galaxy discovered that maybe, just maybe, we were never the underdogs at all. Ready to find out what happens when the most dangerous thing in the universe turns out to be wearing a school uniform and asking for permission to date your daughter? The Grand Ballroom of the Stellar Congress had never hosted anything quite like this before. Crystal chandeliers that had been crafted from the compressed cores of dead stars cast prismatic light across beings from every corner of the known galaxy. The air itself seemed to hum with the collective power of those present. Diplomats whose words could end wars, military leaders whose fleets could glass entire worlds, and ancient entities whose very presence bent reality around them. Ambassador Zilthak of the Vorthan Empire adjusted his ceremonial war crown, its edges still sharp enough to slice through titanium. Around him, the greatest minds and most feared warriors in galactic history mingled with an ease born of mutual respect and barely contained violence. This was the annual convergence, a gathering where the galaxy's elite came together to discuss matters too sensitive for normal diplomatic channels. "The humans are late," rumbled General Korthax, his 4 massive arms crossing over a chest that had deflected plasma cannons. The Brutari were known for their punctuality almost as much as their ability to tear apart battle cruisers with their bare hands. "They'll be here," said Counselor Merrick's, though her 3 golden eyes betrayed a hint of concern. The Celestial had lived for over 10,000 years, long enough to remember when humans were still throwing rocks at each other on their primitive world. Humans are unpredictable, but they honor their commitments. That was certainly true. In a mere 300 years since first contact, humanity had gone from a barely spacefaring civilization to holding a permanent seat on the Galactic Council. They had proven themselves in battle, in diplomacy, and in that peculiar brand of stubborn determination that seemed to be their species' defining characteristic. The massive doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a deep, resonant chime. Conversations died as beings turned to see the human delegation enter. At the front walked Ambassador Elena Vasquez, her black diplomatic uniform crisp and her bearing confident. Behind her came a small group of human officials, military officers, and, "Is that a child?" whispered someone in the crowd. Indeed, among the delegation was a young human female, perhaps 16 or 17 by their reckoning. She wore what appeared to be a formal dress in deep blue, her brown hair arranged in the simple style favored by human youth. She looked around the ballroom with the wide-eyed wonder of someone seeing such a gathering for the first time. Admiral Thrace of the Hegemony Fleet leaned toward his aide. Why would they bring offspring to the convergence? Ambassador Vasquez's daughter, Sarah, the aide whispered back after checking his datapad. According to the files, she's accompanying her mother on what they call a cultural exchange program. The human delegation moved through the crowd with practiced diplomacy. Ambassador Vasquez greeted old allies and former enemies with equal grace, her daughter following respectfully behind. The girl seemed fascinated by everything. The architecture, the diverse alien forms, the ancient artifacts displayed throughout the ballroom. Ambassador Vasquez, Zilthak approached with his usual directness. "An honor to have you here again. I trust the journey from Earth was pleasant." Indeed, it was, Ambassador Zilthak. "Thank you for asking. Elena smiled warmly. I'd like to introduce my daughter, Sarah. She's studying xenocultural relations at the Academy." The young human stepped forward with a polite bow that somehow managed to acknowledge the customs of 6 different species simultaneously. It's an honor to meet you, Ambassador Zilthak. I've read extensively about Vorthan military philosophy. Your treatise on strategic patience is considered required reading at our academy. Zilthak's eyebrows rose. Few beings bothered to study Vorthan military theory, and fewer still understood its subtleties. You have read the stratagem of waiting storms. In the original Vorthan, sir, though I admit I may have missed some of the nuanced metaphors. A murmur of surprise rippled through the nearby aliens. The Vorthan language was notoriously difficult, with 17 different tonal variations that could completely change the meaning of a word. Even seasoned diplomats typically relied on translation matrices. Your pronunciation is excellent, Zilthak said, genuine approval in his voice. It seems the next generation of humans is even more formidable than the current one. As the evening progressed, Sarah Vasquez proved to be remarkably well-educated and surprisingly mature for her age. She discussed trade philosophy with the merchant princes of the Spiral Arm Consortium, debated the ethics of terraforming with environmental scientists from the Green World Alliance, and even held her own in a conversation about quantum mechanics with Professor Vex, whose species had mastered faster-than-light travel when humans were still using stone tools. Remarkable, General Korthax admitted to his aide. The child knows more about galactic politics than some of our junior officers. But it was when the evening's formal presentations began that things took an interesting turn. Each delegation was expected to share something significant, a new trade proposal, a scientific breakthrough, or, at minimum, an update on their civilization's current status. The Stellar Federation announced a new exploration initiative. The Hive Collective revealed improvements to their bioengineering techniques. The Ancient Ones, as always, spoke in riddles about cosmic events yet to unfold. When it came time for the human presentation, Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward to the central podium. "Honored colleagues," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "Humanity comes before you today, not with grand announcements or new technologies, but with something far more precious, hope for the future." She gestured toward her daughter. Sarah represents the first generation of humans born after the Great Contact. She has grown up in a galaxy where diversity is not just accepted, but celebrated, where knowledge flows freely between worlds, and where young minds can dream of possibilities we never imagined. Sarah stepped forward, and for a moment, the powerful beings in the room saw not a representative of humanity, but simply a young person full of curiosity and enthusiasm. "When I was little," Sarah said, her voice clear and confident, "my mother used to tell me stories about the galaxy, about worlds made of crystal where the Lidhans compose symphonies in stone, about the great libraries of Nexus where knowledge from 1,000 civilizations is preserved, about the warrior poets of Vorth who find beauty in both creation and destruction." She paused, looking around the room at faces that were alien yet attentive. But the most amazing thing she told me was that all of these incredible beings, all of you, were willing to accept humanity as equals even though we were so young and inexperienced. That gave me hope that maybe someday I could contribute something meaningful to our galactic community. There was something in her voice, a sincerity that cut through the usual diplomatic niceties. These were beings who had heard thousands of speeches, who could detect deception across species barriers, who had been manipulated by silver-tongued orators from worlds humanity had never even heard of. Yet there was something about this young human that seemed utterly genuine. "The future of our galaxy," Sarah continued, "isn't just in the hands of our leaders and generals and scientists. It's in the hands of young people from every world who are willing to learn from each other, to build bridges instead of walls, to dream bigger than any one species could dream alone." She smiled, and, for a moment, every being in that room felt something they hadn't experienced in centuries of diplomatic gatherings: actual hope. The applause that followed wasn't the polite acknowledgement typical of such events. It was genuine, warm, and sustained. Beings who hadn't agreed on anything in decades found themselves nodding in approval. But as the evening progressed, and the formal presentations gave way to more casual mingling. Sarah's attention was drawn to something else entirely. Near the refreshment station, a small group of beings was engaged in animated discussion. What caught her wasn't the conversation itself, but one of the participants. He appeared to be roughly her age, though his species was unfamiliar to her. His skin had a faint silver sheen, and his eyes held depths that seemed almost ancient despite his apparent youth. He moved with a fluid grace that suggested enhanced physical capabilities, and when he spoke, the older beings around him listened with a deference that seemed unusual. "Mom," Sarah said quietly, tugging on her mother's sleeve. "Who's that?" Elena followed her daughter's gaze, and her face went slightly pale. "Sarah, I think we should... No, really, who is he? He's about my age, isn't he? But look how the others treat him. It's like he's..." She paused, searching for the right words. "It's like he's important, really important." Elena glanced around nervously, noting that several nearby conversations had quieted. "Sarah, perhaps we should discuss this later." But Sarah was already walking toward the group, her natural curiosity overriding her mother's obvious discomfort. Elena hurried to follow, her diplomatic training warring with her maternal instincts. As they approached, the young being turned toward them, and Sarah felt her breath catch. Up close, his eyes weren't just deep. They seemed to hold the weight of stars. When he smiled, she felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went beyond the merely physical. "You must be Ambassador Vasquez's daughter," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "I enjoyed your presentation. It's refreshing to hear someone speak about hope without irony." "Thank you," Sarah said, suddenly, aware that her heart was beating faster than normal. "I am Sada, and you are?" "Kale," he replied simply. The beings around him had gone very quiet, and Sarah noticed that several were exchanging glances that seemed almost worried. "Just Kale?" she asked with a smile. "No impressive titles or family names I should know about?" He laughed, and the sound was like music. "Just Kale is fine." They talked for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. He was intelligent, funny, and surprisingly easy to talk to despite the obvious differences in their backgrounds. He asked thoughtful questions about human culture and listened to her answers with genuine interest. When she mentioned her studies in xenocultural relations, his eyes lit up. "That's fascinating," he said. "The interaction between cultures has always interested me. How do you balance preserving what makes each species unique while still finding common ground?" It was exactly the kind of questions Sarah loved to explore, and she found herself launching into an enthusiastic explanation of her theories on cultural synthesis. Kale listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood concepts that most graduate students struggled with. But as their conversation continued, Sarah became increasingly aware of the tension around them. The other beings weren't just quiet, they were still, unnaturally still. Even the general background noise of the ballroom seemed to have diminished. "Is everything all right?" she asked, looking around with growing confusion. Elena appeared at her daughter's side, her face carefully neutral, but her body language screaming tension. "Sarah, I think it's time we rejoin the main gathering." "But, Mom, I was just talking with Kale about now, Sarah." There was something in her mother's voice that Sarah had never heard before. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something that might have been fear. Sarah looked back at Kale, who was watching the exchange with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Perhaps your mother is right," he said quietly. "It was wonderful meeting you, Sarah Vasquez." "Wait," Sarah said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Will I see you again?" Kale glanced at Elena, then back at Sarah. "That would depend on many things beyond my control." As Elena guided her daughter away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, something she didn't understand. The way everyone had reacted to her simply talking to another young person seemed completely out of proportion. "Mom," she said once they were out of earshot, "what just happened back there?" "Nothing, sweetheart. Just diplomatic protocols." That wasn't about protocols. Everyone looked like they'd seen a ghost. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face her mother. "Who is he really? And don't tell me he's just another delegate's son, because I've met plenty of those, and none of them made an entire ballroom go silent just by talking to me. Elena sighed, looking suddenly older than her years. Sarah, there are some things about galactic politics that are too complex to explain quickly. Can you trust me when I say that some conversations are better left for another time? But Sarah was 17, and 17-year-olds are not known for their willingness to accept vague answers about things that interest them. She spent the rest of the evening watching Kale from across the room, noting how beings who could face down battle fleets seemed nervous in his presence, how conversations stopped when he approached certain groups, how he seemed simultaneously part of the gathering and somehow separate from it. It wasn't until near the end of the evening, as the various delegations began to prepare for departure, that Sarah's curiosity finally overcame her mother's warnings. The main ballroom was beginning to empty, with beings heading toward the transport bays or retiring to their assigned quarters. Sarah had lost track of Kale in the crowd, and was scanning the remaining guests when she spotted him near one of the large observation windows that looked out over the station's docking complex. He was alone for the first time all evening, staring out at the stars with an expression that seemed almost melancholy. Without fully thinking about what she was doing, Sarah made her way across the room toward him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, joining him at the window. He turned, and for just a moment, his surprise seemed to crack some kind of carefully maintained facade. "Sarah, you shouldn't what? Talk to you? Why not?" She looked out at the view herself. Dozens of ships from across the galaxy, their running lights creating a constellation of artificial stars. This is my first time at one of these gatherings. I expected it to be more formal, more distant. But everyone's been really welcoming. Everyone except when they're around me, Kale said quietly. "I noticed that too. Want to tell me why?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "Sometimes who you are matters more than who you want to be." That sounds like something someone much older would say. "Maybe I'm older than I appear." Sarah studied his profile as he looked out at the stars. There was something about him, something that went beyond his unusual appearance or the way others reacted to him. A weight, a gravity that seemed to pull at something deep in her chest. "Kale," she said softly, "who are you really?" He turned to look at her then, and for just a moment, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not just depth, but vastness. Not just intelligence, but knowledge that seemed impossibly old. "I think," he said carefully, "that's a question better answered by others." Before Sarah could respond, she heard her mother's voice calling her name from across the ballroom. Elena was approaching with quick, determined steps, her diplomatic smile not quite hiding her concern. "Sarah, there you are. It's time to go. Just a few more minutes, Mom." Kale was just "Now, Sarah." This time there was no mistaking the command in Elena's voice. Sarah looked back at Kale, who gave her a small, sad smile. "Until we meet again," he said. As Elena led her away, Sarah called back over her shoulder, "I hope that's soon." She didn't see the expressions that crossed the faces of the beings who had overheard her comment. She didn't notice the quick, worried conversations that immediately began in several languages. She didn't catch the way her mother's shoulders tensed or the sharp look Elena exchanged with several other human officials. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, she had met someone who made her feel like the universe was full of possibilities she had never imagined. It would be 3 days before she learned that Kale wasn't just another young delegate. It would be a week before she discovered why entire civilizations might have very good reasons to fear a 17-year-old girl saying she hoped to see him again soon. And it would be exactly 10 days before she would stand in a room full of the galaxy's most powerful beings and say 5 words that would change everything. "Mom, that's him." But for now, as the human delegation prepared to depart the station, Sarah Vasquez was simply a young woman who had met an interesting young man at her mother's work function. She had no idea that their brief conversation had already set in motion events that would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. She had no idea that somewhere in the depths of space, ancient monitoring systems were already tracking her biometric data and running probability calculations. And She definitely had no idea that the charming young man she couldn't stop thinking about was the one being in the galaxy that every military strategist, every intelligence agency, and every precognitive oracle had been specifically instructed to watch for signs of romantic attachment. Because if there was one thing that could potentially destabilize the carefully maintained peace between civilizations, it was the possibility that the single most dangerous entity in known existence might fall in love with a human girl from Earth. The transport ship that carried the human delegation away from the convergence station was one of the newest in the diplomatic fleet, equipped with engines that could cross the gulf between stars in a matter of days rather than months. As the vessel jumped to hyperspace, carrying Sarah toward what she thought would be a quiet return to her studies, detection arrays throughout the galaxy began registering increased activity. On Vorth, military analysts noticed unusual patterns in deep space sensor readings. In the hegemony core worlds, intelligence agencies flagged several anomalous energy signatures. And on a dozen different worlds whose names appeared on no public star charts, beings whose job it was to monitor certain very specific threats began making urgent communications to their superiors. The game was changing. The question was whether anyone would figure out the rules before it was too late.